Is Ukraine hosting one of the great epics of this century? Should we pay attention to world events? Is a tax on electronic devices a good thing? And is a haircut the same as getting gender-affirming care? We'll talk about all of these takes and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes from all across the internet. We take on the bad ones, we highlight the good ones, and try to have some fun along the way. My name's Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can find us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and at Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. And without further ado, let's get into the first take of the day. So we've got a tweet. I think this is the first. Is NATO this is their actual profile? So they're blue check marked, but I'm not sure anymore whether that means because anyone can buy it. But they've got the actual handle NATO. So a tweet from the official NATO account, I'm assuming. And they tweet, Ukraine is hosting one of the great epics of this century. Quote, we are Harry Potter and William Wallace, the Na'vi and Han Solo. We're escaping from Shawshank and blowing up the Death Star. We are fighting with the Harkonnens and challenging Thanos. That's it. What do you think? As a fellow, lover of both history, because they got William Wallace and, fiction, do you think this is cringe or not cringe or good or not good?
I just wanted to curl into a ball of cringe. So this is the official NATO account, and this isn't NATO's quote. They're quoting a Ukrainian soldier. But
oh my gosh.
To me, this is the exact level of cringe that all the memes make fun of. When you see the soy jack memes of like, I'm just like the Avengers of Ukraine. It's like this guy didn't get that was an ironic, an ironic meme saying that like, don't do that. That's cringy. And this is just, it's all of just the hey, we're relatable millennial bait like all the, and to be fair, William Wallace probably would not be in there if not for the movie Braveheart. Like, let's not be mistaken.
That's very fair. Yeah.
It's not, this isn't a historic call to arms. This is a look at pop culture references. And I think to me, that's what makes these calls so cringy is when you look at great speeches, even if they are artificially created, like in, a Shakespeare play like King Henry V, when you have the St. Crispin's Day speech, or any kind of written or spoken speech that's meant to inspire and calls upon heroes of the past. The reason why those are powerful examples is because they are historic, because they cite things that were really overcome. And all of these are, good stories in a vacuum. I don't hate Harry Potter. I'm not obsessed with it like maybe some of my millennial contemporaries are. I like Harry Potter. I didn't see Avatar, but obviously I like Star Wars. I enjoyed the Avengers, all that kind of stuff. But like these things, aside from William Wallace, didn't really happen. So making this appeal to these fictional events, it just falls so hollow, and it seems really like your appeal of epic, rise to the occasion moments are dictated by, writers in a Hollywood room. Is that really so grand and cool as the moment calls for? So that to me is first and foremost why I find it cringe. And then obviously, of course, the whole context of Ukraine versus Russia. You're not exactly and I don't blame an individual Ukrainian soldier necessarily, because Russia really is on their doorstep in many ways, but it's not as cut and dry as Russia is the empire and we were the rebellion. That's really not a good depiction of what's going on.
I mean, they want it to become binary, right? It's like we are the good guys, they are the bad guys. And maybe this individual Ukrainian soldier that said this is actually a good person and is trying to defend, their home, which, I mean, it's true. It's being invaded by Russia. But then when you kind of zoom out just a little bit, you realize like, oh, okay, it's not like someone's being evil for the sake of being evil because we just want to conquer. It's like, it's actually that we've expanded NATO to Russia's doorstep. The United States has been provoking them. And, Ukraine is just a pawn in that. So it's like, you'd have to get some sort of, fictional reference that suits that for it to actually be even remotely compelling. I also don't think. I mean, they made an error. Maybe it's a language translation thing that's an error. But like fighting with the Harkonnens are the bad guys in Dune. Like you do not want to be fighting with them. I mean, I guess in one way, but that just seems like you're fighting us alongside or whatever.
Yeah, oh sure, yeah.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. I I I don't. I'm not in this person's shoes. But when I am in a state of suffering, right? I've had hard things. I've never been in an active war zone or had my home invaded or anything like that. I'm not comparing that. But when I've had hard things that require courage within me, I usually don't try. My mind, the first place my mind doesn't go to is, oh, I'm just like Han Solo,
Yeah.
or oh, I'm like Luke Skywalker. I'm saying because I love Star Wars; those are my favorite. Or someone in Lord of the Rings or something like that. Like that's not where my mind goes. My mind goes to things like oh, I want to make my parents proud, right? Or I want to be someone that my future children will be proud of when I can tell them about this time of suffering that I've gone through. So I think that also maybe reveals a little bit about whoever's saying this, and it kind of makes me think about like you see all these photos of Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and he just can't be bothered to wear a suit or anything like that. He's always dressed in like some sort of camo or fatigues or something like that, like he's a wartime president, and he is because they're at war. But he wants to like portray this fantasy that like he's on the front lines, leader of the resistance, when in reality, he comes to America, does a photo shoot with Vogue. Has enough time to see soccer games and things like that. It's like
He's on the late night shows and
on the
things like
late
that.
night show.
Yeah.
It's like, nah, man, like the image that you want to portray out into the world, this Instagram, like, oh, this is my life all the time. I'm a war hero is not actually true. And it's an extension of this fictional delusion.
Yeah. I I don't have too much more to say than that. Then, there are plenty of real world examples of heroism that you can look to. I mean, even referencing the St. Christmas Day speech, that was a fictional playwritten speech for a real, actual, amazing battle where the British, at the Battle of St. Agincourt, were completely outnumbered and won the day. Like that itself is a heroic moment that is more akin to the real world situation of Ukraine, if you wanted to view it in that lens, than any of these fictional ones. So, I even if it's not, the way that it comes across feels very placating to, oh, we want to get the popular support of the generation in the United States. We want to appeal very much to American culture here to get them on our side because we're relatable. We like Harry Potter and Star Wars, and that kind of makes me twinge with a little bit of cringe there.
If you wanted to take a historical like a historical moment for this, I would use the when George H.W. Bush basically told the Shiites to uprise against Saddam Hussein, and then when they did, he totally backed out and left them to fend for themselves and get murdered. I mean, that's pretty close to what is going on in Ukraine in terms of, hey, we're going to poke the bear, we're going to fund Ukrainian soldiers to fight a war that they probably can't win, and we're just going to let them die there, so that we can increase some geopolitical power. We can take Russia down a peg, and some people, weapons manufacturers in the United States, can get rich. I mean, that's the most like historical thing that I would liken it to, and that's somewhat compelling, right? Like that probably is more that holds more truth in it than I'm Harry Potter fighting Voldemort. Like it's just not the same thing.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Moving on to our next one. We've got a tweet by Richard Engel. And he tweets out, frankly, I'm getting tired of hearing people, quote, losing interest, unquote, in the war in Ukraine like it's a hobby or new toy. History isn't kind to those who don't pay attention to world events or read the room, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. What do you think, Donnie?
This is a fantastic take. I think it's pretty apartisan when it comes to how you're viewing the conflict in Ukraine, regardless of whether or not you think Ukraine is, the Harry Potter to the Voldemort, or whether you think that it's a lot murkier, like Britt and I would put ourselves on that side. You have to recognize that this conflict is vastly important, not only to the people who are in the midst of the conflict. I would say a lot of Ukrainian citizens who are in the crossfire, both the soldiers on both sides who really have no stake in the game other than just trying to make a living for themselves as being soldiers, and just everything else that goes on with war in general. But you also have to balance this as an extremely important moment in the global history and the history of the United States. If you are from the US, and you need to view it from that lens, all of these different categories, this particular issue is super relevant and important, and it doesn't matter how long it drags on. And in fact, the fact that it is dragging on long gives it all the more weight to something like, how long is the US going to use Ukraine to fund a proxy war? Are we going to let this precedent stand? Will there be meaningful pushback from the American people to end it? What's the uh, you know particular fallout going to be from the various ends? How is it going to end? And God forbid, will this escalate into a third world war? If once we get to the point, and I pray we never do, but if we get to the point where World War III is on the doorstep, we'll be wishing we could be losing interest
Yeah.
in this. And it is the it's important to keep it relevant in the forefront of your mind, if anything, just to try to do what you can to dissuade the continual warfare state, whether that's on a local level or all the way up to a federal one, and doing big protests like the Rage Against the War Machine event that happened last week or so.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of like a Rorschach test, depending on how you like look at it.
Yeah.
Because to you and I, it's like, okay, you're right. Like, we view that there are a lot of different power interests in Ukraine that are trying to push us towards World War III, or at best are being so incompetent and negligent that we're approaching World War III. But other people might see this as like, oh, like uh, there's a war in Ukraine and we need to not lose focus and not lose interest in it. And so therefore we need to send $200 billion more,
Yeah.
Write a blank check to Ukraine for that. I have a feeling, because I don't know much about Richard Engel, right? But he's a reporter for NBC News. So I'm assuming that might be a little bit of what he's saying. Maybe not. I might be wrong about that. But I think that there's something really true about being cognizant of world events and the people who are interested, like the powers that be who are interested in them, what their interests might be, and what their ulterior motives might be, and how they're trying to lie to us, what lies they are saying to keep us interested or make us lose interest in it. Because, the fact is there are a lot of atrocities that are similar to Ukraine that are happening all over the world, but aren't being paid attention to and are being perpetrated by us. I think about the war in Yemen and the fact that, Obama launched 7 wars during his presidency, and millions of people were killed and things like that. And because the propaganda machine was like, oh, well, this doesn't serve one purpose or the other. People didn't have interest in that. And because they didn't have interest in it, those types of wars have been able to proceed and continue with little resistance and billions of our tax dollars going to fund them. And so, that's where I do think it's important. I think I don't know how you would quantify it. It's not I'm going to lose interest because it's not virtuous to like look at it anymore, or it's not like on the hype train or anything like that. But it's more like, hey, I'm interested in not being taken advantage of. I'm interested in people in other countries not being taken advantage of and murdered unnecessarily. So therefore, I will pay attention and have somewhat of I could be able to point to where Ukraine is on the map, and I also know where that we are funding the Saudis and different folks murdering folks in Yemen. So I don't know if I like Richard Engel, but I like this take when I read it from my perspective and put my goggles over it, I guess.
Yeah, well, and that's what I think what makes it a good take, right? Like, you can have the wrong perspective, but the essence of the point of view is still correct, which is things just important things don't stop being important because they're prolonged and you lose interest, right?
Yeah.
I will say I don't disagree with the latter half of the tweet, and I think in the right contexts it also is true and important, but I wish it didn't have to be, which is, if you're listening again, history isn't kind to those who don't pay attention to world events or read the room, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, I wish we didn't have to live in this world where I care what someone in Washington, D.C. is doing to people even further away. But it's the very fact that if I choose to bury my head, that is happening right now, you end up ceding that power to those people. So it's one of those things where we should strive to make a world where I don't have to be controlled by some bureaucrat 500 miles away. I don't have to be controlled. I don't have any say or power in funding bombs being dropped on people across the globe. That would be a better world where we don't have those kinds of things. I don't have to be under the powers of those who want to do horrible things, and therefore they don't have the power to do those things. But as we are in these situations, it behooves us to pay attention to those things, to not just bury our head in the sand and to act like, well, you know what, other people will sort this out. Other people will figure it out
Yeah.
because the Edmund Burke quote, the only thing required for evil to triumph is when good men do nothing. And I think about that as, not the onus to always do something as a government, but as an individual, always stand up to keep check on those things and to try to make sure that the people who are in power aren't abusing that power more and more, and try to disabuse them of their spots of power.
That's good. Moving on to our next one. So this is this like a comment on an article?
Yeah, it's a comment on the headline is the blog post that my
Okay.
coworker wrote for a Washington state bill that's being proposed.
Great.
And
So
then there's a comment on that.
yeah,
blog.
so the Washington State Policy Center had a headline that reads: Legislator 2023 House Bill 1793 is a tax on electronic devices that isn't needed. For those of you who don't live in Washington or haven't read the bill, basically they're going to do a $2 tax on every device that is sold that has internet access that costs more than $250. So basically,
Yep.
every electronic device that has internet access will be taxed an extra $2 on it. And someone commented, yeah, that $2 extra on my $1,500 iPhone. However, could I afford that? Maybe do something about all the thousands of dollars we pay to cover corporate subsidies every year. What do you think, Donnie?
This is a terrible take, not because I don't want corporate subsidies covered, but because this is the exact kind of ignorant thinking that leads to having corporate subsidies like build up, right? To give a little bit of context, the people that are going to be hurt the most by this $2 tax, there's two kind of categories. One is businesses that are buying lots of devices like this in bulk because they need it to run servers, they need it to run, like, all that does is add an extra business equipment so that their profit margin is just a little bit lower, which gives them fewer dollars to pay employees and reinvest back into the company. And the other category of people that it's going to hurt are the low income people. It's going to disproportionately impact a low income person. Low cost cell phones usually range in maybe you can get $250 or $200 phone, but most of the low budget phones are going to be like $250, $300 to $500, and that's considered low to mid range. And so the people, other than people who are just generally more thrifty on phones, which I find myself in more and more, but most of the market for lower end phones are going to be people who can't afford things. And so sure, $2 for you isn't a big deal, but like, that kind of stuff just adds on. All it does is disproportionately impact lower income people. So I think that it's a terrible take for you to assume like, oh, it's only going to be on these luxury goods. However am I going to afford that? And also, it's just another tax. Why would you not oppose that? You're worried about corporate subsidies every year, which is a great thing to worry about. But this is just another introduced new item to get taxed on. Not to mention, of course, that part of what we do at the Washington Policy Center is cover the legislative session. So when a new bill is being introduced, we're going to report on it and say, hey, this is a bad policy, don't enact it. That's exactly what we're doing. That doesn't mean you can't do both things, right? Like, as if, oh, if we're opposing this new bill, we can't go back and oppose bad corporate subsidies as well. Just an overall terrible take from someone who's I don't know, just feels like terminally sarcastic to the point of not seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, it reminded me of when when we initially shut down the country for COVID. I was talking with a guy who was close to retirement age, and he's like, "Man, like my value of my 401k is all the way down and stuff, and you know, but it's okay. I'm willing to pay that price, so that we can all stay safe and." Also, I'm okay with the bill because it's going to keep the airlines running. We have to subsidize the airlines. What are we going to do if the airlines go out of business? And it's like, man, that type of thinking, like that, oh, well, we just have to pay for this. Like that continuously that sets precedent that gets rolled into the next crisis that occurs instead of just letting things happen the way they're supposed to happen. When the airline industry goes down, the airlines that have cash on hand, that didn't do stock buybacks, that made sure that they were investing in things that are sustainable and that are good assets, are going to be able to stay in business. And then the companies that didn't do a good job of that, that spent all their cash, relied on a non-sustainable business model, are going to get gobbled up by the companies that do know how to run their company. Not to mention that we shouldn't have shut down in the first place, but given that that was going to happen anyways, this is the next best thing that could have happened to the airlines. That always puts better and better resources in, or say, puts more and more resources in better and better hands. That's what the market's supposed to do. And so I was reading some articles about this, and that extra $2 or whatever per device. I'm assuming the electronics market in Washington State is somewhere between 4.5 billion to $6 billion. It might be a little bit more because we have such a tech hub here, and people kind of spend more time indoors because it's rainy and stuff like that. But even if you do $1,500 or whatever an iPhone, that's somewhere between 3 to 6 million devices probably sold each year. So that's $12 million. $12 million that is being taken out of the economy that could have been used. Even if it's only $2 per person, that's still an aggregate, a lot of money that could have been used someplace where it would be voluntarily given to people that deserve it, right? And that's what the market does, is it allocates resources where they should be put for the greatest good for the most amount of people. But what these folks want to do with these $2, and this guy is or guy or girl or whoever is so upset about corporate subsidies. It's like, well, what do you think? The $2 that's supposed to go support, infrastructure for people who don't have access to really good internet is gonna do. Like, I looked through the grant proposal, the proposal that outlines what you have to do to get a grant, and it's like, oh, basically there's like a committee that decides. You go to them, you say, hey, Mr. Committee person, here's my request for you to fund X amount of dollars for my school or for my community, and you have to outline what contractors you're going to use. You have to use some sort of approved contractor for it, use approved vendors and all this stuff. It's like, oh, what this is a way for Washington state legislators to take money out of your pocket and give it to their friends that are business owners that want to get these types of contracts, in their hands. And that's how these things all work, right? That's any tax where they're like going to take it and they're going to hire a bunch of people to run the committee and hire a bunch of people to facilitate the disbursement of these grants. It's all just a big old money grab to give it to people that they want to give it to. It's not actually going to help people. If you really wanted to help people, you do something like Elon Musk, and you would launch Starlink, right? And you launch it over where people need internet, because that's a way more efficient way to do it than what they're trying to do, which is deliver broadband all over Washington state to rural areas where people have chosen to live because they want to live out there.
Yeah, you nailed it on the head. The other great thing about this, to point out, this 12 million or so that you estimated from the $2 tax, it's not going to start this broadband fund, for the record. This broadband fund already exists. We already have programs that give people under a certain economic threshold access to high quality broadband. Not to mention, there is already federal funds going to this exact thing. I think it was signed last year or the year before in the wake of COVID stuff. There is a massive payout that the federal government's doing to give states a certain budget allocated to build broadband into areas that don't have it for rural areas. So not only are all the things you said true, but the program that's being described already exists. So all it does is add more slush funds to these corporate subsidies. And just a fun fact, I think I've mentioned it on this show before, but there was a study done in Louisiana, because they had tried to do these sort of government funded broadband to rural areas. So they did like a poll of all people who didn't have high speed internet access. And I don't remember the exact numbers because it's been a couple years since I read this, but it was the majority of people didn't have access, or no, they gained access. That's right. They built out the infrastructure there and they gave them access, and people just chose not to connect because they didn't want it. They didn't care, they didn't need it, and they didn't want it. So they built all this out, they created it, and they said, oh, the only reason why these people don't want internet is because they just don't have access to it. Once we give them access, they'll totally use it. And it was something like 60 to 70% of people didn't use it even after it was available for them. And so it's the exact opposite of a market where you know attract people based on providing a high quality thing, and then as people adopt it you can build it out and provide it. They're trying to force this down people's throats, say, oh, you want this, you need this in this area, and instead it just ends up making it so that we pay extra and that money goes sitting wasting. Now eventually it might be useful, but by that time the money could have been invested and a better technology could have been built over its place that won't need to be updated as soon as the broadband that gets built out now. So it's this fallacy of like, oh well, if we build it eventually it will be used, without realizing that time where money is not being or resources in general aren't being used to grow and to build is an opportunity cost loss. And so you're robbing people in the short term to lose essentially what could be profits and could be more resources down the line.
Yeah, there's in product development, there's this term called product market fit, and when you're developing something in a process called iterative product development, because there's so much resources that are going to be given, in both an R&D, potentially physical goods and materials and things like that, and then just time. People want to validate their products before they launch them, and in iterative product development, they drive to this thing called an MVP, or minimum viable product. And that's basically the smallest subset of features of a product that can be that someone will pay for, right? And that what someone will pay for is key, because if you launch an MVP and you make it free, and maybe you get, whatever it is, thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, like, awesome. But what does that mean in terms of like the ability for that product to sustain itself? It means absolutely nothing, because you have to determine what someone's willing to pay for it, whether it's actually useful. And the way to do that is to say, no, you must pay for this, and even if it's $1, right, or something like that, because that means that this is actually communicating something of worth. If someone is willing to part with $1 to use this product, it means that it's actually useful for them. And for internet, it's like, well, if everything's about trade-offs, right? So if someone values internet more than what they're currently living right now, they will sell or do something different to be able to get that internet. And I get it. There are people that can't afford things. They can't afford the best type of internet, but there is something holding them back in one way or the other, right? And sometimes there are circumstances, I get that. But on a mass scale, people that live in rural areas are going to have less internet, but they've decided to make that trade-off because they enjoy living in a rural area as opposed to living towards Seattle or another urban area where they can get good internet. So they've chosen that trade-off. The ability to get better internet exists for them, and they're not choosing it. So why are you going to take $12 million, give or take, from all of us and say, oh no, these people actually do want it? Like, no business that's developing a product would ever do that and be successful, because you want to make sure that if you're going to invest time and money and spend it on something, you want to make sure that the people you're spending it on actually want that, or else it's literally just being thrown down the drain. And that point is further hit home by your point that, like, we already have funds for this, right? And it's not effective. Like, why are you requesting more from us if this is such a needed thing and it's such a success for us to just take money and dump it into whatever type of infrastructure we need? Why are we not getting good results from the money that has already been given at the federal and state level? It's like, well, it's because it doesn't work and it doesn't matter and people don't want it.
Yep, that's exactly right.
All right, moving on to our next one. We got a Twitter user, Dr. Julia, and she tweets, any dudes out there got a hair transplant, used Viagra, taken pre-workout or protein shakes to improve the effects of exercise, gotten a haircut? Congratulations on your gender affirming care. Did it make you feel more like yourself, how you want to feel and appear? And then in later threads, she does the same thing for women. Did you get Botox or whatever, which is ridiculous. But tell me what your thoughts are on it.
If you think that there is no substantive difference between a haircut and chopping off something down there that God gave you, I think that you are deluding yourself into an oblivion. There is a fundamental difference between something that is irreversible, something that is a change that defies your very basic biology, and something that is a natural part of the human experience. The it's such an absurd take. It's almost hard to tackle it in a cohesive way, because
Yeah.
it if you're dealing with someone with this level of cognitive dissonance, they obviously aren't going to respond to logical, reasoned out arguments. But the very basic um, truth is that, like, doing something um, as a transitionary surgery. I'm trying to keep it a little bit family friendly here, but if you're doing certain acts that are required for a full transition, does not change the physiological makeup of your DNA and of your chromosomes, and of those realities. They also, as much as people want to say that gender is a social construct and has nothing to do with your sex, it doesn't change a lot of those natural inclinations that your body has. And in order to do that, you have to completely artificially change those things. Now, I would argue that something like pre-workout and protein shakes, or even a haircut, those things are natural in a sense that you are enhancing stuff that already exists. You're building upon processes and things that it's not fighting your body's natural inclinations. It's fighting some levels of atrophy, which is true, in that if you don't take care of yourself, your body is going to change in certain ways. But it's also true that there are no processes by which you would ever change your sex in a natural way that is not completely unnatural. You can almost do everything else on this list to some degree in a natural way that does not involve an external product or an external procedure. You can work out without having protein or pre-workout. It only enhances that experience. As far as a haircut goes, like, you can let your hair grow out and that's fine. It will naturally kind of cave off at a certain point, but you're also not fundamentally altering yourself when you get a haircut. There is no natural process by which you will ever change sex, because that is not a natural process, and it is just a fundamental and categorically different level of operation than anything listed here by a remote margin.
Yeah, the underlying argument that this person is trying to make is that, like, we all try to change reality in one way or other, right? Like, if you're getting a haircut, you're changing reality. Using your will to and scissors to change something about you. If you are going to work out or anything like that, it's changing reality. But what makes the examples this person give is makes it basically, you if you evaluate it along the lines of what does it cost to change that reality, and how effective after you pay that cost is, the effort to change that reality yield. It means these things are basically different in kind than transgender or gender affirming care, because I guarantee you, if I told you, hey Donnie, you can get a haircut, it's going to grow back tomorrow, and the cost of it is that you got to chop off your pinky finger, I don't think you would do that. And I think you would think that was probably not a good, that is way different than saying, oh, I'm going to go to the barber shop and spend $20 and get my head shaved. That's a way different cost. I think that also, if we saw kids in high school or in middle school taking pre-workout and protein shakes in such a way that was giving them liver failure, or that their kidneys couldn't process, we're like, hey, you got a problem that isn't healthy. You shouldn't do that. I don't take pre-workout or anything like that, because it doesn't make me feel very good, and I don't think it's necessarily always the best for your body. But other people can, and it's fine for them. But everyone knows that there's a limit of how much you should take before it starts affecting you, right? And you have a mental problem if you're trying to change reality in such a way that it actually damages you. And that's what we are trying to say here when we're talking about gender affirming care, is that gender affirming care is you have an obsession with something that you want to make happen, and the cost is harmful to you. And in reality, you're not actually even changing yourself, right? You are still a male or a female based on how you were born, the sex that you were born as. You can't actually change it. And there's so many traumatic effects that occur when you try to change that. And so that's one, right? That's the underlying premise of all of this. To take that even further, because this person's talking about children, right? Like, I could even see it's like, hey, you know what? If there's an adult, they're 21 years old, and or whatever age it needs to be an adult, and they've kind of grown into their brain and all this stuff. And despite everyone's pleas, all the doctors saying no, like, this is not a good thing. We're adhering to reality and trying to explain reality to this person. They want to chop off various aspects of their body. They want to do that themselves or find someone else crazy enough to do it. Like, okay, that they're going to go do that. we should not be doing this to children who have no ability to consent to any of these sorts of things, and who, if they were harming themselves in pursuit of changing something about themselves that can actually be changed, we would stop it right then and there, because we are responsible for taking care of children in that way. Children don't have the ability to consent. They don't have the ability to think through that. They don't have agency yet, full agency to make those types of decisions.
Yeah, let's even think about something that's as trivial amongst this list for a child as like a haircut, right? A parent makes a determination of their children's haircut when they are young, because a kid, a lot of people have stories of like, when I was a kid, I took scissors out and I gave myself a haircut and it looked terrible, looked ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that's not only just because of obviously the mechanical failure of not being able to give yourself a haircut. There are also stories like back on cringe posts of where like you make a stylistic decision about your hair that you regret later.
Yeah.
And the parents are going to make the best calls they can. But like, for instance, there was a summer when my parents let David and I, we really wanted to, my brother and I, get like shaved heads, and we did it. And then one of our friends, he said, "Hey, look, it's the Baldy brothers." And we're like, "All right, never again." But it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, if we had to, I don't know, like go somewhere super important in the next 2 weeks, my parent probably would say, "Hey, you know what? Not this time, because this is a decision where this is going to have more important consequences than the short term effects are worth." So, how much more important is that for something that isn't just a matter of growing back in 2 months or so? Something that is fundamentally going to alter their entire physiological
Yeah.
experience, developing and growing. It's the parent's responsibility to protect that, to preserve that, and to let the child develop beyond the whims that kids have for things where they don't have experience. They feel all kinds of things. They don't know how to process those feelings or interpret them well. And so yeah, so there's a lot of things, and that's also why, like, the higher up you go on this list, the more barriers there are to those things. Like, you probably wouldn't let a kid take protein shakes or pre-workout because it's not good for them. You definitely don't let kids take Viagra, and that's why,
Yeah.
there's certain limitations on things like that. You also probably wouldn't just be, if your kid was like, "Hey, I want a hair transplant," you probably wouldn't give it to him. Unless there was a demonstrated need. So when it comes to children, this entire argument is completely flat and even weaker than before.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about like how it changes physiologically, like,
Yeah,
because I think permanence is also another dimension
yeah,
among this, right? Because
definitely.
with a hair transplant or a haircut or anything like that, it's like, oh, that's not, there's nothing, your hair will grow back, right, at some point. So if you get a bad haircut, you are about a month away from either getting a good haircut again, or getting a good haircut, or getting a bad haircut again and having to repeat it. The permanence of chopping off these different body parts and things is, it can't be understated how important and devastating that can be. And especially when you look at like stats, surveys taken of underage people who identify as transgender, 94% of them by the time they're 25 kind of grow out of it,
Yeah,
right? Like they might not necessarily be like, traditional or normal or anything like that in terms of like from a cis standpoint, to use these people's language. They might identify as gay or lesbian or something like that, but they adhere to the biological sex that they are, were born with, that they actually are. And so if 94% of them are doing that, it's like, man, that's like a really, it's irresponsible to have them make a permanent change that they probably will regret later in life, or that they would have grown out of. If anything, it's like, hey, until you're able to think clearly about this and to actually make these decisions, you shouldn't be, and kind of know who you are. You shouldn't be chopping off things that you can't put back on.
yeah, agreed.
All right, moving on to our last one. This one was from, I think you were saying a while ago, but it's kind of evergreen and a fun one to talk about. So we've got a tweet thread. First person to tweet is Bernie Sanders, and he writes, "Healthcare is a human right." And then Kurt, parentheses libertarian, replies, "So is gun ownership." And then another person replies, "No one's trying to take your guns, boomer." And Kurt replies, "I'm not worried about people taking my guns. I just want the government to pay for my guns." And someone else replies, It's the right to be able to own a gun if you want it. It's not the right to be given a gun. Kurt goes, "Oh, is that how rights work? Then why does everyone say I need to be given health care?" And to me, we're evaluating Kurt's replies. This. So what
Yes.
do you think?
I think
He's
it's
good or bad?
fantastic. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a great take. It's the perfect demonstration of positive and negative rights and the theory that those have. The idea of a positive right being I have the right to something, to be guaranteed something, to do something, to access something. A negative right being I have this right that, it is illegitimate for you to violate. So for instance, it would be a positive right to say human healthcare is a right because you're saying you demand access to something, whereas I have the right to be left alone or I have the right to defend myself is a negative right because I'm not saying that you have to provide me something or I get something. I reserve the right to take this action or to not have you impede on that action. So this is just a really great demonstration of that, and I think that the by and large what the rights that are in the Constitution are positive rights that, well, some of them are positive, but they're state, and some of them are negative, but they're state issued. And so when Bernie Sanders says healthcare is a human right, I think that that's one of the interesting things because he's trying to make it a legal positive right. And he claims that it's an intrinsic human right. But I think that all intrinsic rights are negative rights. I think that you don't have positive rights to anything unless the government makes it a legal right. When we're talking about human rights, I think all human rights have to be negative. Otherwise, a human right to something else demands someone else's labor. So
Yeah.
for instance, if you're saying healthcare is a human right, not a government granted right, if you're saying it's a human right, then you are saying that you are born owed someone else's labor. And I don't think that that's true. And it's very hard to ethically or philosophically demonstrate that that's the case. So when he goes down this and he talks about gun ownership, when we talk about the Second Amendment, it's generally understood that the reason why the Second Amendment is so important is not because we all have the positive right to a gun, like he kind of cartoonishly acts in this thing. And obviously he doesn't mean it because he's playing this bit very intentionally. Um, it's not that we think you are born with the positive right to metal and gunpowder and bullets. It's the this the Second Amendment is you have a legal government granted right to what at the time is the most advanced form of self-protection, recognizing that the human right is a right to self-defense. Every human has an intrinsic right to defend themselves from someone else who is aggressing upon them. And so this is codified as quite a positive right, but it is expressed as in the form of the government will allow you to have guns, since that was the most advanced, sophisticated form. There's no constitutionally guaranteed right to swords, for instance, because guns kind of beat out swords,
Well, he
but
said
it's
arms,
understood.
right? And
Well, yeah,
arms could
arms,
refer.
sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is more broad. But what I would say also is there's no constitutionally guaranteed right to like a big rock, to lug over your opponent, your friend or enemy's head, because that it's understood that when you have these things to defend yourself, it's kind of a cascading tier. So that's I don't know. I just think this is a really good demonstration of like when you talk about government granted rights and human rights and things like that, you have to be making this distinction of positive and negative rights.
Yeah, there's what's the saying? It's like this is why we can't have nice things. And people like Bernie Sanders are like very much like, no, we deserve to have nice things, right? And there's no qualifier for why healthcare specifically is a human right. Like you're saying, I'm Bernie Sanders probably doesn't even know, the terms positive and negative rights. But it's like, okay, if that's a human right, why is that a human right? What is the moral baseline for why that is? What is the principle that undergirds that leads to a better and more ethical and moral society? And they can't describe that. Whereas with negative rights, like you're talking about, it's like, hey, like you have the right to choose your own destiny. You have the right to, defend yourself, and you do not have the right, to go infringe upon other people's basic rights like that. And all other things could go or not go depending on which society you live in and the rules of the property that you're on. Um, and that's like those things adhere to a principle, right, of freedom, where freedom is somewhat of the highest virtue. And that comes with the caveat of like you can't infringe upon another person's freedom in one way or the other. But there is no, what is the principle that undergirds healthcare being a human right? Like they might say something like, well, it's nice, or it's like the kind thing to do, but that's not something that you can really structure a society around if you care about freedom, if you care about things that are that are actually scalable, right? Like this healthcare, like you're saying, demands that you violate a right that supersedes healthcare to provide it. And it's the same type of logic, that people in the South were making about slaves. It's like, well, if we free all the slaves, like how are we going to pick cotton? Like, how is that going to happen? Like, we're not going to have any clothes, and we have a right to wear clothes. That's like, well, that's you're not understanding that there's something that supersedes your right to have clothes, that supersedes your right to someone else's labor, which is that person who is providing that labor for you deserves to have agency over themselves. And so people don't understand. I mean, it's like kind of the costs of products. It's the same. We had that take from that kid a few months ago who was breaking down, the profit of like a Burger King, right?
That's
Which
right.
is like, it's like, well, I'm assuming they make about $2,000, an hour, and so they can afford to pay their people $20. It's like you think that, or no, he was calculating what the value that a burger flipper at Burger King is. It's like, oh, well, the Burger King flipper makes $2,000 an hour. That's what they generate, so they should be owed most of that. It's like, no, like, do you think that the entire value occurs when the burger flipper like flips the burger? It's like, no, it occurs through the supply chain. It occurs through the people that raise the cows, and it occurs through the people that organize to make sure that and sourced those things to get there. But those people don't think through that, right? They don't think through all the people that are involved in making something happen. And in the same way, they're not thinking through, like, you could say healthcare is a human right, but what is required to make that a human right for people? What is required to actually execute and provide that? It's like, oh, the answer is other people's labor. And if it's a right, that means that you could just take it whenever you want in as much quantity as you want. That's slavery.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the easier resources have been to acquire, the more detached we are from the process of that, especially at the raw material level, the more people just they dehumanize and they disconnect the labor that goes into it, and therefore they think that these rights manifest in such a way that they are entitled to it. And I think that this kind of thinking is only going to get worse as automation continues to grow and grow. And people are going to say, well, if this is all automated, well, then no one's actually even working to provide this, and it's you miss the back end costs of the investment.
Then it doesn't need to be human right. It's just provided.
Right? Yeah, right, sure.
Or it's at a cost that is. That's the thing about an automation that people don't understand. It's like when things get easier and less expensive, like you don't actually have to qualify it as a right or whatever. It's just like so affordable that almost everyone can afford it.
Right. Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is, if someone invests in automation that is able to do this en masse, and they're still mad because they're charging, it's because those machines are going to require upkeep, those machines required investment, and there's going to need to be investment for the next great thing that can help cure things. So just the more disconnected we are from this, the more people are going to feel entitled to this. And I think that's why in the slave trade, for instance, so much of it hinged upon this idea of slaves not being equal, not being real human people. Because if you could, disconnect the personhood from the labor that provides you this right, then it's okay to treat them like crap and to rely on this free labor. And so in the same way, if you just say healthcare is a human right, and you don't think about the people whose labor that requires and at the base level, and the people who you have to essentially take force to work, then you don't have to think about it in terms of you actually taking people's labor for free from them, if it is in fact a right. And that's what the pernicious thing about taxes is that taxes essentially steal your labor in little increments that are not visible to any one person. So for instance, if the government were to say, hey, you owe me, let's say for the year I owed $500 worth of taxes, let's say that's all I owed. It's like, okay, so for this year, you owe $500 worth of taxes. I can hand them $500 and walk away. And then everyone's like, see, that wasn't so bad. That's, now you can pay for the human right of healthcare. But it becomes a lot less appealing when they say, hey, you owe us $500 worth you owe us $500 of taxes, so we're going to demand $500 worth of your labor. You're going to come to the government and you're going to work for us for 2 weeks, and we're not going to pay you. And you still have to buy your own food, and you still have to go home in your own lodging. We're not going to pay you at all. We're just going to kidnap you for 2 weeks. And
That's a
all the
great
work
point.
you do is going to be put towards this person's healthcare. Like that, then it becomes a lot different of a thing. But that's all taxes are. That's all you are doing when you're taking people's money. But it's so dispersed. It comes from so many different forms that you can say this nebulous thing like healthcare is a human right, and it should be provided to people for free, because all we're doing is stealing people's labor little bits at a time. And this, of course, is all a system that's very much supported by the very people who say you own your own labor, therefore you should get paid nearly $2,000 for flipping burgers.
Yeah. I really like your point about how if you put taxes in a way that like people actually had to work, or like the work that occurred to gain that money was actually used up front, or required up front, like most people wouldn't be able to stomach that at all, and they'd see it for what it is.
I'd hope
I mean,
anyway.
yeah, I would hope so too. But I mean, most people, I mean, they look at, I remember the first time I got a paycheck.
Yeah.
I was working at a corn maze when I was like 14 or something like that. And not like an actual paycheck that was like had stuff garnished. I did lots of jobs where I got paid cash, like I sold wood and stuff like that. But the first time I did it, I just had this vision in my head, because I would chop wood, give it to someone, and they would give me $300 for a cord. Like that's how transactions worked in the world. And then when I worked at this corn maze, because it was right next to my house, and I got a check, I was like, I looked at it, I was like, oh man, like $218 gross, $194 net or whatever it was, because they took their 10 or 11% or whatever. I was like, what? Like, what is this? Something's wrong. I thought that they were shortchanging me, like the business themselves, because I didn't understand the concept of that yet. So I think most people's like visceral reactions to paychecks means that I think people would react poorly to it. And maybe we should, if I ever became president, I could only make one decision before I was assassinated, because that's what would happen to me. I would sign in something like that, right? Which would cause people to realize, like, hey, businesses can either make people work for the government, like lend them out to the government for a week, to pay their tax, or they can just garnish it. And I think people would see the reality pretty quickly.
Yep, I agree.
Awesome. Well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us. And if we said anything that you think might be a bad take, let us know. We'd also love to hear from you just in general in the comments and stuff like that. And we will catch you on the next one.